Hello, I'm Scott Gavorski.
And I'm Kristen Newton.
Welcome to 775 Alive. This is a new podcast where we're going to be discussing issues about the world, the nation, the state, and local issues that are affecting rural Nevada, by which we mean that area outside of Las Vegas and Reno covered by the 775 area code.
And we are broadcasting today out of Elko, Nevada, which is one of those rural counties, but maybe not for long. Huh?
Well, yeah, there is a possibility. There's some demographic shifts going up here. But right now, we still are rural Nevada.
Still rural, big city.
Yeah, up here in northeastern Nevada. Actually, Elko is the fourth largest state in the country, about 57,000 people spread over 17,000 square miles. So,
Yeah, for me, it's the Starbucks index. Like, if you have a Starbucks, I don't know if you can be considered.
Yeah, Winnemucca doesn't.
No, we do not.
We don't have a Starbucks. So, and you get a sense of course, it's winter here. It's wintry. It's blustery. We're going to be showing some backdrops from local photographers here, just so you at home can get a sense. This is actually from the Ruby Mountains, just south of Elko, Liberty Lake. We do have some alpine areas here. This is, of course, hiking up there this time of year is not recommended, but beautiful in the summer.
I have plans to go hike that. I've not done much hiking in Elko, but
okay.
I have back in Humboldt and a little bit of Lake Tahoe. How
okay.
is this Lake Tahoe?
Yeah.
But anyways, it is a beautiful place.
Oh, yeah.
I cannot wait. Maybe we could go together.
Yeah.
Today we are talking about legislatures. I know that sounds like a boring topic, but it's critically important, especially now. In November, we had a red wave.
Right.
And everyone's been super excited about the red wave. And basically that means we took control of the Senate, the House of Representatives. We've had control of the Supreme Court. And of course, we have the presidency, the trifecta. We're close, though, to possibly losing some leads.
Right.
And it is important that people understand that red wave is not a guarantee of success over the next we have an election coming up again in 26 and 28. And so on and on it goes. So we wanted to do a little breakdown of both the U.S. government and the Nevada legislature, which is one of 4 states.
Right.
That only meets once every 2 years. And I found that fascinating. That was something you told me. I'm always learning stuff from you.
So, yeah, the Nevada State Legislature does meet every 2 years. Texas, North Dakota, and Montana, I think, are the other 3 who meet every 2 years. And, of course, this happens to be our biennial legislative year. And by Nevada law, they can only meet for 120 days unless called into special session. So it's a circus, right?
4 months out of 2 years to get everything done.
Which means thousands of bill requests and whatnot.
I like to imagine the Nevada legislature as a roller derby, a little bit of, especially this one, because I know the first resolution every new legislature passes the decorum, the rules, and of course the first thing to come out was changing the nameplates from assemblywoman and assemblyman to assembly person, and then of course there were a few of our people that were like, no.
Well, and there's actually an interesting story, because I think this illustrates, just to connect, and not just Nevada issues, but I think it also illustrates sort of a national sort of thing. So it is true that we have actually, despite the red wave, we actually have Democratic majorities in both the Nevada State Senate and the Nevada State Assembly. Yeah. In fact, we're one vote short of supermajorities, Democratic supermajorities in both. But what happens is again, Nevada, like most other legislatures, first thing they do is they pass sort of the rules of the session, right? These are usually pro forma. Well, what happened this time is actually recently Nevada State Legislature 2023, the last one, I think, sort of actually made American history by being the first state legislature with majority of women. Right.
I didn't know that.
Right. So they have been a majority of women. And a situation occurred where there was a bill sponsored by a number of members of the assembly who were females. And so, the bill was sponsored by Assemblywoman so-and-so, Assemblywoman so-and-so, Assemblywoman so-and-so. Well, Steve Yeager, who is the Democratic majority leader of the House of Representatives, wanted to sign on to this bill. He signs onto this bill as a co-sponsor. And because of standing rules, the assemblywoman disappears. So it all has to be listed by Assemblyman so-and-so, Assemblyman so-and-so. It's some bizarre arcane rule. And justifiably, that should be changed. And that was what they tried to do in this Assembly Resolution 1, which sets the basic rules, is that basically the records would record all assembly members as assembly person instead of assemblyman and assemblywoman to prevent these sorts of issues. Had that been the spirit, I don't think this would have been a problem. But then they went the step further and made them change the nameplates on all the doors. And a lot of the assembly members on the Republican side were really upset about this. Alexis Hansen had quite a bit to say, and you've worked quite a bit with Alexis.
I haven't worked with her. I've had some interactions with her where I felt I really got to know her. I think she is brilliant and hysterical, and she has a great common sense and way about her.
Right.
I fully support her. But it does not surprise me that she was one of the people that said,
"Yeah,
no, not on my watch."
Supposedly put pink tape over the door and everything. And then Jill Dickman, who is another Republican assemblywoman, made this great statement. It's like, here we are, the first women-dominated legislature in the country, and we can't refer to ourselves as assemblywomen because of supposedly this non-sexist language that was passed by again, Democratic male leader. And it's really causing some controversy. There's some rumors, and we'll point out they are just rumors, that this has gotten so bitter that some of the people who have protested the most about this have been told that, good luck getting their bills heard in a reasonable fashion. Don't know if that's true.
Makes sense, though.
It makes sense, but it really, I think, highlights sort of a growing division and why this, turning back to national, why these divisions sort of make sense, or why these divisions are so important. So when we look at the red wave, very much like the Nevada legislature, which was a real disappointment, I think, for Republicans. But even if we look at the supposed dominance of Republicans at the national level, there is currently only 218 Republican representatives and 215 Democratic representatives in the House, right?
Right.
So it's a 3-vote margin right now, and there's 4 vacancies.
Yeah.
So there's more vacancies. Now, 2 of these vacancies, of course, Matt Gaetz on the Republican side resigned in November. Presumably, he was going to pursue the Attorney General's position. I think a lot of people think this was an effort just to remove a thorn to the Republican side.
Yeah, sacrificial lamb.
And then Mike Waltz, of course, took a position within Trump's cabinet. Both of those are from Florida. So there is an election coming up here in Florida that could flip 2 seats. It's not likely. I don't think it's likely. But there has been a lot of Democratic campaign activity.
And that should take place the end of April?
Yeah, somewhere in April. I think it's actually early April.
They'll hold their elections for those Republican candidates.
Well, it's for the representative seats, right? But they weren't super strong Republican districts, from what I understand. But there's a good chance the Republicans will hold those. Far more interesting has been the Democratic side, though.
Yeah.
So here in the last 2 weeks, a little more than 2 weeks, we've actually lost 2 Democratic representatives. One, the former mayor of Houston, Sylvester Turner, I think was his name, passed away in early March. He was just into his first term as a congressman, right, national congressman, served a long time in the Texas House of Representatives before he became mayor of Houston. But then a Democratic representative from New Mexico just died earlier this week, right? So there's 2 more elections that are going to have to be held. Chances are, my thinking is that both of those will probably be held by Democrats. Certainly, I'm almost positive the Houston one will be. They haven't been scheduled yet. New Mexico, that might be a toss-up. I'm not an expert on New Mexico politics.
Yeah.
But the point is, we've got supposedly Republican dominance, but also have a House that's in play with special elections right now, right? We could end up with a 219 to 218 or something weird like that.
And if I may, before we get too far past the deaths of the Democratic leaders, I would like to pass on my condolences to those constituents that lost their elected representative. I might be conservative, but I certainly I put the practice of democracy in a republic over party politics. So condolences to the Democratic Party. I hope you're able to reorganize and figure that out.
Yeah. And it is shocking, although one thing that has been sort of dripping out here over the last couple of years, of course, there's a lot of concerns that we have a gerontocracy. that got Congress is run by old people. You had Chuck Schumer, and this really hit the height with Biden, and Trump's not that young himself, right?
No, but I got to say, there's no way. I watched his schedule. I could not keep up.
Oh yeah,
I don't understand how he has so much energy. I'm half his age.
Right. But
I get tired watching him.
and the presidency does age people. I mean, this is one of the
same.
Well, no, I think it has. He looks far older now than he did in 2016. So.
Yeah.
But but what's really interesting is starting to come out is Democrats, there's been a lot of discussion. Did they really have a bench? They have a new generation coming up, and they need it much more than Republicans because there's a rather sharp distinction. And sort of the average age of the members of Congress, Republicans tend to be much younger.
And prior to researching this podcast, I had the opposite in mind, and I think a lot of people do. They think of the Republican Party as the one with the gerontocracy issue.
The geriatric issue. Well, I mean, it's just like democracy means. Yeah, just like it's also a Greek word, right? Instead of just power to the people.
I want to clean it up. I like the overly wise among us.
Well,
they're past their.
You know what that is in Greek, right?
No.
Well, technically, if it was the overly wise, it'd probably be something like a sophiocracy. But the Greeks would have used the term, when I'm talking to people like Aristotle, would have used the term aristocracy, which means the best.
Okay.
Right. And we don't want an aristocracy. Let's just make that clear. Right. Because how do you determine the best? Well, elections are in, and that gets us back to our Republican democracy, right? Mm-hmm. But our Democratic Republic, however one wants to view this. Sorry, we're drifting off this. But going back to this issue, we have that tight margin, I think, between the two groups. Mm-hmm. But I think more importantly, these groups, I think, are separating in their perspective. When we've seen this here recently,
the continuing resolution with Chuck Schumer and their band coming into at the last minute on Friday.
Right.
To keep the government from shutting down. And again, another illustration of like one part of the party's going this way and the other part of the party's going this way.
Except I think that might have been a much more just straight tactical move on Schumer's part, because the problem is if Trump has shown a willingness to sort of really exercise executive power in ways that we certainly haven't seen in many, many years. But more importantly, it's not clear what these limits are.
Now, hold on. Would you say that if Biden, to me, ruled the executive office by executive order, which to me is an example of using these powers and levers that aren't traditional for governing?
Yeah, well, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's been one of the issues that has really emerged here, I think, over the last 10 years, although the argument over the imperial presidency that Schlesinger, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and others have been made has really been something going back to the Kennedy administration. But what I think has happened is Biden used these executive orders very aggressively. You're right about that. But the bureaucracies under the executive branch were sort of let loose to do what they do. Trump has moved against those executive bureaucracies. And the question we're having now, so you have the executive orders.
It's an important distinction. Yes.
Right. But you also have control over the bureaucracy. And I think what Schumer was saying is that if they shut down the government, which a lot of Democrats wanted, by default,
Trump would get even more
power over these bureaucracies.
Because they'd have this emergency situation and emergency powers. I said,
And I think so I don't, I'm not thinking that this was some sort of grand value stand on the behalf of Schumer and them. I think they pushed it as far as they could go. And then, the least bad choice from their perspective was to support the continuing resolution. I was actually thinking Trump's address as a much greater sort of illustration of this division we've seen.
Yeah. I mean, watching the two sides of that house, I would say interact, but there wasn't really much interacting. It was one side, and they seemed to.
Right. And it was two totally separate visions in some way. And let me.
I got super stuck on the guy shaking his cane. I was like, is this what? Is this theater? That was my style. Is this theater?
Well, it's all politics is theater to a certain extent. And of course, being a historian, people shaking canes has some very negative repercussions. And lead up to the Civil War, there was a beating by cane. It almost beat a senator to death in the Senate. You're right.
I've heard of that. And to be fair, I doubt many Americans get a chance to watch British Parliament, but oh my gosh, those guys are mean.
Oh yeah. And they have the division.
They call names and they are shameless. It makes us look like we're pretty darn civil.
Well, everybody, to a certain extent, each parliament. I mean, we're certainly not to say what we've seen in South Korea back in December, right?
They have like 5 parties, don't they, in England? More than 2, right?
Well, they have technically 2, but only 2 really count.
Okay.
Right. The Liberals, I mean, you had the New Libs under Tony Blair, but I don't think they've really stuck. But that's
contentious.
Right. And a very long one. Of course, they have the division belt too. right? Those of you who are Pink Floyd fans probably remember their 80s album. But, there's a bell that the Speaker in the House of Commons can ring that's supposed to okay, everybody go back to your corners, right? The fight is stopping.
I'm shocked when I watch them.
Oh, yeah. I always like Parliament.
Give it a chance.
And of course, the French National Assembly years ago, and some of you viewers might know I'm actually a historian of France, when their prime minister at the time, Dominique Villepin, got onto him for not acting on something and accused him of lâcheté, which is a French word for cowardice. And the assembly just blew up being called cowards, and he lost his job soon after. So, we didn't see anything.
Take the gloves off.
Yeah.
Smack.
Yeah, but so shaking a cane doesn't bother me. But I will say, I think part of what happened is, I think there was two different reactions shown in that chamber. And I think part of what happened with that was that Trump's speech was really atypical, I thought, right? I mean, it was supposed to be a joint resolution at most, or joint address that most, new presidents make, sort of outlining, okay, here's where I'm going to go. Here's my priorities. It's not quite a State of the Union, although Trump treated it as that. But more importantly, this was not a Trumpian speech. It was focused. There was a logical path. I mean, he still got his zingers in, don't doubt about that. Yep. But it wasn't these non sequiturs we're seeing. There was a precision of language, particularly when talking about Doge and the difference between fraud and waste in some of the pieces that I frankly don't remember ever hearing in Trump speeches and whatnot. And I actually think that caught the Democrats really off guard.
Yeah. And it really shouldn't have, though, because when you're in campaign mode, the idea is to present an argument, a narrative, a speech that is as vague as possible, because that makes it the most open to interpretation. So when the listener is hearing the speech, there's a lot of wiggle room for them to say, yeah, that's my issue. He's speaking to me. But when you roll out of campaign mode into executive mode, that's when you have to be very clear and precise.
Although I think the Democrats would argue we didn't see that precision in Trump's first administration.
Yeah.
Right. And
I think he was thinking, it worked for the campaign. I'll just keep doing it through the presidency. And that's where and you see a lot of fixes the second time around. He's really learned.
Yeah.
Like he's been in Mar-a-Lago, taking notes.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's true. And I think that explains, some of what we saw on the Democratic side, just in the form of protest. That type of protest, I think that they worked again with the little paddles and whatnot, might have worked if they were up against a Trump, let's say 2017, that was making a lot of non sequiturs and just attacks. And you get some good graphics of this. And then you have Alyssa Slotkin come in, which was the most interesting part of the evening in some ways. She was the Democratic respondent. She's out in Michigan. Best response speech that we've seen on either side of the aisle in, a decade or so. I mean, it was really good speech.
And she kept it short, which was a great move on her part.
But it was at least until you got into the policies. Now, a lot of the policies didn't change from the previous administration, but the framing, I think, was set up very specifically to appeal to a center after what they thought was going to be a very traditional Trumpian address. And then they didn't get the address, and that's the end of it. Right?
Yeah. So what are the further parallels that you see between the U.S. government and the Nevada legislature?
Yeah, I think that's
in terms of the party politics, do you see a lot in common with the Democrats at the U.S. level of our country and the Democrats at the Nevada state level?
Well, I do. I think there is a sense, and this goes back to this nameplate issue that we sort of started with, is that there's I think almost a focus on the Democrats on these issues that are cultural. And I think on the Republican side, there's a lot of concerns about more basic, more traditional governmental issues that need to be solved. So while we're arguing over stuff, whether, the Democrats want to argue whether the president can stop an agency for paying for Sesame Street memory. And the Republicans are like, okay, what does that Sesame Street? Let me point out that I'm old enough. I grew up in the Cold War. I think the Sesame Street in Iraq is not an example of fraud. Now, it might be waste, and it's perfectly okay to look at the value of that program, which is what I think the Republicans in Congress are really saying. Congress needs to look at these programs, and are they worth the value? Now, some are fraud. We have that credit union speech where, $7 billion supposedly disappears in November after the election to a nonprofit organization that isn't registered with the IRS and doesn't seem to exist, right? It's just sort of like, that's probably fraud, or at least deserving of a fraudulent investigation. Let's put it that way. It might be legit and nobody did the paperwork, but it's still it's still something that needs to be investigated. But the Sesame Street one, I think, is more of a question where the waste is going to come down to values. But I think the Republican position in all this is we need to sort of look at this and see what's going on. The Democratic side seems to be, well, Congress gave the bureaucracy this power, and we just can't question the bureaucracy, right? And that's a problematic statement for me, right?
It is. And I like your distinction between waste and fraud.
Mhm.
And that is something I have a particularly keen eye on because I'm a terms and conditions person.
Mhm.
I want to know the terms of the contract and then make my decision from there. The bigger overarching issue I think that we're seeing in this country is a difference of value systems.
Right.
And you see the conservative side that believes that if you have something that's working, you stay the course for the most part. You can tweak things here and there and try to change things and progress things, but you do it in small amounts
Mhm.
because the culture is a very delicate ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest issue, I think, that between conservatives and liberals is that the conservatives want to leave space for the infrastructure and the foundation to stay intact. And the liberals only seem to want to spend money on cultural, how should I say it, fiddling.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, I really don't think it is wise for a government to get involved with the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you look at it from that perspective, the Republicans have always gone for the conservative pathway. They haven't
Mhm.
changed. What's happened to them in our perspective is the liberals have come in and they're deciding now they're spending all that infrastructure money on cultural things,
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally trying to change our culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where the rift is. And you'll start to see that in the legislatures. Like
Right.
one has a cultural ideology, like with the nameplates. Like
Right.
first thing we do in the Nevada legislature is change it to assembly person instead of a
Right.
man and woman. But the conservatives balked at it
Mhm.
because we believe in staying the course. You
Right.
don't change things willy-nilly for just bizarre reasons. But I think that's right at the heart of it is the cultural spending versus infrastructure spending.
Well, I think that's exactly what's emerging. Although I think just to complicate this a bit, I think there is.
Please.
Yeah. Now, you should have known this was coming,
Let's
folks.
get the calculus up.
Yeah. No. The dynamic is. I think that part of the perspective of the Democratic side is that a lot of the infrastructure issues have effectively been solved. That's right. There's a perception that these don't need to be re-examined because we know what to do. We just need to do it. And that's part of the reason why they support bureaucracies, right?
Just real quick, who has the worst roads in the country? What two states do you think?
Okay, I grew up in Ohio, and we always said it was Pennsylvania. Right.
The Northeast and California.
California,
Basically, they have the highest taxes, the infrastructure spending, but they have the worst roads.
Well, in California,
what's solved?
Well, yeah, no, but no. Let me give you a more specific example here from Nevada that I think plays into this. So for our second legislative in a row, we've got an issue with a rural county trying to build a school.
White Pine County.
In this case. Now, last legislature, White Pine did pass it. And White Pine County is probably one of our more remote counties. I mean, Ely's, far from everywhere. It's about halfway between Elko, where I live, and Las Vegas there on the Utah border.
Is it true it was in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and they go out to Baker through there?
They might have went out to Baker at some point. I'd have to reread the book.
To give people. So White Pine County is just south of Elko. So
Right.
Just south of here, just almost strictly mining.
Now, remember, we're in rural Nevada, so just south means a 2-hour and 45-minute trip.
Yeah.
Right. So, bear that in mind.
Or a couple podcasts, as I call it.
Yeah. But the White Pine County schools have, so their elementary school and their middle school are both over 100 years old.
Yep.
They're falling apart. It's gotten so bad, I think their middle school is 3 stories, right? Built in the early part of the 20th century, 3 stories, doesn't have an elevator, is not ADA compliant. And they've had students, one just testified in front of the legislature or legislative committee on these bills, that the student broke their leg. And to get to classes, classmates had to carry him up and down 3 flights of stairs with a broken leg.
Mm-hmm.
And the issue has been, not only because of that isolation are we seeing it's incredibly expensive to build a new combined elementary and middle school 2 years ago, when they tried to get through the legislature, it was supposed to be about $60 million. It's apparently gone up to $90 million, according to the White Pine County superintendent.
Well, the cost of things have gone up.
Well, and it's also at the end of supply chains, and there's a whole range of other issues. And the point is, rural counties cannot raise the funds, right, to do that. So we've got two bills. One would just be a straight funding bill. The second, which is supported by a Democratic legislator out of Las Vegas, wants basically the state of Nevada to effectively be a co-signer, right? So White Pine County would take out a loan in the name of state of Nevada, using Nevada's bonding capability to bond for a school that White Pine County can't fund itself. Why this is intriguing is the parallel situation last time dealt with a school up here in Elko County on the Duck Valley Reservation, the Shoshone Paiute Reservation up here on the Nevada Idaho border. Another situation, have a Bureau of Indian Affairs school that is falling apart. It was built in the 50s, so 75 years old, basically. It's falling apart. They have some severe environmental issues from another federal project. The school gets transitioned to Elko County Schools in the 1980s. And when the proposal was first put to the legislature by Alexis Hansen, right, and her husband, Ira, who serves as a senator in the state of Nevada.
Told you she's awesome.
Yep. The legislature's first reaction was, why is the state paying for a county school? That's a county responsibility. And this was done because we have a legislature that's not only dominated by Democrats, but more importantly, is dominated by predominantly Democrats from Las Vegas because of population disputes.
Yep.
And in their mind, this is a problem for rural counties to solve, even though those rural counties don't have the finances and the financial capability they might have had 50, 60, 70 years ago when these schools were built. But when Las Vegas wanted the stadium, we had a special session last year. So when the Oakland A's decided to move to Las Vegas, right?
Oh, that's important.
That's important. So,
I mean,
yeah, and I think this is an interesting. We had a special session. The governor called the legislature back into session after the 120-day deadline to vote state funds to build a stadium, and only barely got past the funds for this school up at Owyhee, which is a much more complicated situation because there are some treaty obligations involved and so on and so forth. But, I'm thinking the chances of White Pine County schools getting legislation passed this time is very slim. And again, that stadium over five times the amount, so about $317 million, if I remember right. So we're looking at something that's, almost 4 to 5 times the amount of what it would cost to build that school in White Pine County.
Yeah. Got
spent on a sports stadium. That a lot of people were like, why didn't Vegas fund this itself?
Yeah. So the Democratic Party has an overarching strategy that I think is important to mention here. It helps to understand what kind of bills they put forward and what their prerogatives are and their end goals. In general, Democrats want to move people out of the rurals into suburbs and urban areas because they're easier to service. They're, from a government perspective, they're easier to service. And things like this, they don't have to build a school that's hundreds and hundreds of miles out in the middle of nowhere. And so they think, it's just more efficient to do that. And we just did our mining episode where we're talking about how there is no mining industry without rurals. So we have this conflict within the state where Democrats are pushing forward legislation that is really making it difficult to continue to live out in rural areas. And we're trying to figure out, we can't really fund ourselves because we don't have revenue from mining really. So it just comes down to Clark County, the revenue they generate and where they want to spend it. And you combine that with the legislature that's majority controlled Democrats, you start to see why White Pine County is not getting a school.
I don't actually think it's a revenue issue as much as it just is a representation issue.
Okay.
Right. Because I do think, even though, and we again, in this mining episode, we talk a little about some peculiarities under the Nevada Constitution about what the state can get in revenues from mines. So, go ahead and subscribe and follow us. But that being said, I think there is a representational problem. Again, about 70% of the population in Nevada lives in Las Vegas, right? Only about 10% live out in the rurals, right? So that's the rest are in the Reno, Carson City sort of metropolitan area up in the Northwest on the California border. So there is a representation issue, but more importantly, I think there's a knowledge problem in the fact that if you look at some of the registration numbers, and right now, just started this year, Republicans took a very slight edge over Democrats in registration numbers here in Nevada. our Secretary of State, which is a good policy, publishes these registration numbers every month.
And that is something both Scott and I have participated in, getting people registered to vote and carrying out the voting locations. We participate in all that every cycle.
But one of the things that's going on, I think, is that if you look at the breakdown, you have a Democratic Party where something like 95% of the registered Democrats in Nevada live in either Vegas or Reno, right? Which is a far higher percentage than those two places really have of the legislature, or of the population distribution. So I think you have a Democratic Party in Nevada that's very much urban in perspective, and I don't think has a lot of experience with the rurals. And there was an important lesson taught to him in the 2020 election with Sisolak. Right, who very famously, our former governor Steve Sisolak, very famously said he didn't need the rurals to win, right, and got punished, right, because it was really the rurals who delivered Lombardo's, or not 2022, 2022 election, delivered the governorship to Republicans, because the rurals, even though we're 10% of the population, we have about 15% of the registered voters. Right. And we deliver on average about 20%, almost 20% of Republican votes.
We have a huge turnout compared to Democrats, which is the only reason we're hanging on by the tips of our fingernails. And also, I wonder, this is not something I've researched, but I'm wondering how much is also, you were saying that these Democrats in Washoe and in Clark, Las Vegas and Reno, they just lack knowledge of the rurals. But I also think that probably a good chunk of them came over from California or had a footprint in California for a while, because that's typically who migrates over to Reno and Las Vegas.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. Although on the Republican side, we've seen, particularly since COVID, a lot of California Republicans moving into the rural areas. I think there's actually a bigger issue, though, with the rural demographic, because I agree that there is a presumption that the future is urban, if we can say, from the Democratic side, right? Even without getting into the conspiracy of the 15-minute cities and everything. I think there is a perception, but that comes from a long-standing, what I refer to in an article series I write about the myth of the dying rurals. That starting in the 1960s, it looked like rural America was dying. It wasn't producing children. What children were produced left. And I think that's still pretty much the perspective of a lot of people in urban environments of rural America, that it's dead and dying. And that creates some pushback against, why are we repairing rural schools? And we talked about, it's not just the ADA issues. The rural schools in Ely have real problems with water leakage, ability to heat and cool efficiency. We see that in Waihe. Tonopah has an absolutely horrendous set of situations with their elementary school where they have entire classrooms that have been shut down for mold. These are really dire issues, but if you're sitting from a perspective, looking at a pot of money in an urban environment and believe that the rural areas are dying, it's like, use what classrooms you have to use, because in 10 or 15 years, you're not going to need that building anymore. You're not going to have kids, right? So therefore, it's not worth an expenditure of money. Here's where the problem comes in.
I got a problem with it too.
Well,
after you,
there's a moral problem.
But other than that,
on the statistical side, though, that dynamic seems to be reversing. So there's been a lot of data that the USDA's Economic Research Service, the Rural America at a Glance, last edition, it just came out looking at 2023 numbers. It actually appears rural America is starting to grow again. Right? We're seeing a shift out of cities. Whether it's sustainable needs to be born, but there's also the fact in Nevada, and this is the weird case. So I'm in Elko, Crystal's over farther to the west in Humboldt County, even though we're neighboring counties.
Humboldt, Nevada, not Humboldt, California.
No.
Forgot to clarify that.
Yeah.
Everyone assumes.
But no, there is a Humboldt County in Nevada. Winnemucca is the center of it. But the
you're gonna have to put that up on the screen.
We'll put that up.
Who?
Well, yeah, we'll put that up. But more importantly, those two counties are the two youngest counties in Nevada, both by median age. And I say that the first response to everybody I said that to when I worked on the census and everything else was that, well, that's just all the minors in their early 30s. It's not, because those two counties also have the highest percentage of their population under 18, about 27%, which is about 5% higher than the national average, right? So the two youngest counties are the ones that find themselves in a position of begging a state legislature for funding the schools that an urban audience is saying, well, you're just old people and we don't need you. I figure out that dynamic.
Yeah. From my perspective, there's a cycle going on. And this is part of what Trump's trying to do with tariffs, which is going to be a different episode. But around the 1970s, the middle class was responsible for about 50% of the GDP of the country. Right now, manufacturing's sitting at about 10%. I know those numbers don't seem wild, but we're talking about a 60% loss, which really is what I think we saw with the rurals going down.
Right.
And yeah, if it went on that trajectory, it would die, but that's not how things work. Things are really cyclical, and especially with Trump putting in those stopgaps to try to encourage manufacturing here, we may very well see rurals taking off again. And our legislatures are going to have to look at that and reprioritize if that's the case.
Right.
But there's also a cultural pushback. We saw that with Yellowstone. It's probably the first time a representation of rural life was mainstream. People watched it and loved it. So there is a huge community of people that do see the value of this lifestyle.
And it's sort of odd with Yellowstone, because I think one thing I think we might want to look at in the future is how the rurals in Nevada might differ from, say, the rurals of, southern Indiana, Illinois or something, right?
And someday we're going to do that, because I work in Mexico and we do some work with the rurals in Mexico. There's some parallels that are interesting, but that's another episode.
But I do think where this touches on is Yellowstone's a great example of where it's not 100% cultural, but there's also one of the great underlying themes, I think, of Yellowstone that is playing out here is this idea among an urban elite that rural areas' only viable economic feature is entertainment for urban audiences, recreation destinations, skiing, off-road vehicles, that type of stuff. And that, I think, is a real damaging approach. I'm not saying we can't provide that. I mean, one of the great benefits of both the areas we live is, like we're talking about, the hiking. We have heli skiing here, and some other issues. But I think there's a real problem when you're reducing, because you're effectively saying the only thing rural America is good for anymore is sort of like servicing the restaurants from people from urban areas who want to go out and play in the rurals.
It's a bit insulting. It feels like we're a bit like zoo animals. You're coming to look at us, and it's like. And we like to be left alone. It's probably the biggest problem with the rurals becoming an entertainment for urban people is like we like to do our work and be left alone. We think it kind of weird if you're staring at us.
Right.
It's just not going to work out well.
Right. Well, and I think that combined, this gets back just in sort of an effort to wrap this up back on track is I think this is a good way to connect back to this cultural versus infrastructure issue.
Yep.
Because I think one of the problems that's going on is that rural infrastructure is becoming expensive. Some of that is supply chains. Some of that is just the cost of doing work. But some of it is also policies pushed by government agencies and government representatives based predominantly in urban areas, whether it be prevailing wages, whether it be one of the big problems here is getting anything done. We've seen a shift somewhat in development out here that even if you want to build a housing development, 15, 20, 30 years ago, the housing development would have presented like a set of plans to the public and people could decide, well, what's going on now, and rezoning an area, say from open space, which is in some ways what is the term, at least in Oakland County, for sort of baseline zoning, right? If it's nothing else, it's open space. To zone it into a residential zone nowadays, they don't require the plans, right? And companies don't want to invest in doing the plans because they have to do the environmental resource survey and all this other stuff until they have the zoning changes. So I think one of the things that you're starting to see is that a lot of this stuff that's been added to the government level is increasing cost in rural districts to the point where rurals can't maintain or replace the infrastructure they have. And then an urban environment that's claiming, well, we're not responsible for your infrastructure. And by the way, we also need you to change how you're doing stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's a good part of the tension we have.
It's something I did recognize with the Biden administration was I hate to say the term flips levers because it is pretty vague, but with the executive orders that he issued, I think there was 15 on day one. He shut down the border wall, the Keystone Pipeline. And to me, it looked like all the conservative industries.
Right.
Was it?
No, go on.
Okay. So to me, it looked
we had a Heron microphone. It's doing an earlier take.
To me, I noticed for the first time, and this might have happened with previous administrations, I was just not paying attention, but Biden coined the term. I saw the move from conservative industries to the government taxpayer dollars being spent on social infrastructure. Do you remember when he coined that term?
Right.
That was their attempt to move it off of infrastructure spending to these cultural fiddling. Sorry, I got to come up with a better word. Cultural fiddling, and they're using taxpayer dollars to do it. But we saw that said out loud with Biden. He said, this is social infrastructure. So our infrastructure spending. And then you see on the rural side, we don't have any money to build our schools. So to me, I can fit those two pieces of puzzle together. I'm like, I see what happened here. We stopped spending money on physical infrastructure and we started spending it on social infrastructure. Right. And that's a big part of it. What I think DOGE has been tasked to do is kind of rip out some of those things, like you're saying, right. Elmo and Iraq.
Right.
Like,
right. And again, I'm a Cold Warrior enough. I don't think that's a problem. But yeah, I think.
And you and I have both done Arabic studies in college. And I mean, you and I know better than anyone that culture is not going to absorb Elmo and Sesame Street.
Well, not in this.
It's not meant as a bad thing. No. It's just that's not compatible with their culture.
Yeah, I'll disagree. This is another podcast we can do. But I do think you're onto something in the fact that we're seeing, again, Nevada State Legislature right now. You have White Pine County Schools is dealing with leaking roofs, is not capable of meeting ADA standards. And then a legislature is like, well, that money should be better spent. I mean, literally, that state money should be better spent on stuff like additional boundaries for Spanish language teachers, right? So in addition to the pay you get as a Spanish language teacher, there's a bill up to give you a $2,500 a year bonus on top of whatever in your contract. But what good is that teacher if the school's not working?
In McDermott, it's I think a $10,000 or $15,000 bonus for teachers that will move out there.
Right.
But I mean, there's not really any available housing.
Right.
We're so far out in the middle of nowhere.
Right. And that's one of the issues is that there are these sort of key components of physical infrastructure that are lacking in rural areas that desperately need to be built, and they're being ignored for issues I think in many ways only appeal to an urban electorate and an urban audience. Not saying they're not real issues, and nor am I saying there's a lot of urban infrastructure that's breaking down as well that needs to be replaced. I mean, most of our infrastructure right now in this country is nearing that 50, 60, 70-year-old gap that it was engineered for. And I think there is a perception that, we've already built it. It's it doesn't need to be replaced. We don't need to think about it. Well, yeah, we do. It's not going to last forever. And I think that's part of the tension we're seeing in the legislature, both at the national and the state level, is this priorities.
It's very, I would say, bipolar in that regard, because they're not, those aren't compatible pathways.
No.
At all. And I mean, I'm biased, but I feel like we're in the moral right because we're making a choice between a child not being able to make it upstairs in their school system and somebody learning to better cope with their gender identity.
Right.
I mean, that's the choice that we're making right now. It's fine for this kid to be carried upstairs, but it's not okay for this kid to have his feelings hurt.
Right.
And I'm like, and again, I'm biased because that's the perspective I come from, but I really think government meddling in culture is, well, you're the historian. How often does that work out for countries when they start to regulate the culture?
Well, I mean, it depends on what level of regulation.
Yeah.
So,
and I'd say like there's a difference for a tiny country.
Well,
like they can do stuff that big countries can't do on micro levels, but a big country, I don't think I've ever seen them fiddle with culture and end well.
Oh, no, I would disagree with that totally.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, a great example, actually, France is a great example. Eugen Weber's great work, Peasants and the Frenchmen, that talked about this effort to sort of create a French nationality out of what had been for centuries, these sort of distinctive groups. And one part of that is language. This is why the French put such an emphasis on the language, is this becomes a unifying factor for the country. So there is some of that, and we see that in American history. Noah Webster's dictionary. This is why it becomes important, because we're gonna be Americans with spelling our words without the U, right? And that type of stuff. But
we're different.
But no, these are big issues. But I think it is something that we're starting to see a real stark contrast now, and I think it's very interesting that's playing out both at the national and state levels, and something we want to keep an eye on, definitely. So, well, we want to go ahead and wrap up here, but if you've enjoyed the discussion, we've got other stuff, mining, we've got some other episodes that will be dropping soon. You can go ahead and visit us at 775alive.com.
And on that website, you can find the information you need to register to vote if you are not. We spent this whole episode talking about how tight our lead is.
Mhm.
And we don't have a lead in the Nevada legislature. It's important that everyone votes. So go to that website. There's some great resources there. Even a quiz. It's kind of a quiz. I've taken it.
Little Nevada quiz you can go ahead and take.
It is. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time.